This week, the veil of diplomatic nicety has been shredded, revealing the cold, hard machinery of compromise and coercion. We are witnessing a transition from the stagnation of attrition to the volatility of negotiation, where the cost of national survival is being calculated in ceded territory and moral concessions. In Eastern Europe, the roadmap to peace looks less like a treaty and more like a surgical amputation. The U.S. administration is pushing a 28-point framework that caps Ukraine's military capacity while simultaneously transforming the state into a, quote, poison pill, end quote, fortress, designed to deter future Russian aggression. But this delicate architecture is being sabotaged from within Washington's own corridors, where leaked tapes of U.S. envoys coaching the Kremlin have triggered a domestic political firestorm. Meanwhile, Kyiv is leveraging this chaos to escalate economic warfare, turning the Black Sea into a kinetic kill zone for Russia's shadow oil fleet. In the Levant, the day after scenario has effectively arrived, and it is defined by a fractured landscape of warlordism and containment. The diplomatic vision of a unified stabilization force is colliding with the gritty reality of clan-based militias, proxies now funded by Israel to fill the power vacuum. Simultaneously, a controversial green zone strategy is taking shape, a plan for gated, vetted compounds that critics fear will formalize the partition of Gaza into safe islands and festering zones, cementing a permanent architecture of segregation under the guise of humanitarian relief. And in our own hemisphere, the war on drugs is being rapidly militarized into a war on terror. A gruesome double-tap strike by SEAL Team 6 has exposed a chilling shift in the rules of engagement, where the legal designation of cartels as, quote, terrorist organizations, end quote, is being utilized to bypass due process in favor of lethal kinetic solutions. With Venezuelan airspace unilaterally closed by social media decree and the USS Gerald R looming off the coast, the administration is blurring the lines between counternarcotics and regime change, turning the Caribbean into a battle space where the entire region risks becoming a free fire zone. In this episode, we dissect the anatomy of unjust peace, the rise of state-sponsored warlordism, and the perilous legal attacks turning police actions into open warfare. All right, Kervin. It has been a breathless week, as you can hear in my voice currently, and it's leading into a wild weekend. So, has it not done that? I mean, in a matter of a week, suddenly the battlefield shifted from the field to hotel conference rooms in Geneva and encrypted cables between Washington and Moscow.
Yeah, it certainly has, Tiana, and I can hear it in your voice. There's a lot to get into, right? And we are witnessing what appears to be the transition from the war of attrition to a war of pure negotiation. And as we know, the latter can be just as volatile as the former.
Yeah, and it's all happening so fast. First, we started with the 28-point peace deal from the US, and then a few days later, we were talking about a revised 19-point plan that stripped out some of the harsher demands. Now, we are back to discussing that 28-point framework, and all of this happened during one of the busiest holidays of the year for the United States. What the heck is going on here?
Yeah, it's diplomatic whiplash to say the least. I don't want to get too hung up on the number of bullet points. So whether it's 19 or 28, the core architecture remains the same. The U.S. administration is pushing a framework where Ukraine will trade territory for sovereignty.
But sovereignty with a chunk of your country missing feels like a hard sell for Ukraine.
Yeah, it's going to be an incredibly hard sell for Zelensky. But look at the details that are sticking here. The 28-point plan includes a cap on the Ukrainian military of 600,000 personnel.
That was framed as a restriction, wasn't it? Like a concession to Russia?
Yeah, in the media it was, but analytically, that's a massive number. And for context, most European NATO members struggle to field armies a fraction of that size. That's why they're in NATO to have a full force there. And we talked about this last week, but I want to provide some clarity here. So if Ukraine is limited to 600,000 active troops, but they are then backed by Western security guarantees, not assurances, but guarantees, they aren't really being demilitarized. They're being turned into a fortress. I consider it a poison pill for any future Russian invasion. If Russia invades Ukraine, whether their military is capped at 600,000, they would have the full force of NATO to defend themselves against Russia with these guarantees. And you can take the land you currently hold, is what the U.S. and what Ukraine might say, but you are not Russia. You will never take Kyiv.
So the argument is that this is the least bad compromise, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we always knew that there was coming compromise is bad, right? When an aggressor invades your sovereign nation. I put this at unjust peace. So you reward the aggressor with land that's morally repugnant to many, including both of us on this podcast, if you want our opinion. But you secure the survival of the state of Ukraine.
Okay, now I have seen some reporting that the domestic blowback here in the United States has been fierce, and a lot of it was triggered by a leak. We have to talk about this leaked conversation between United States envoy Steve Witkoff and his Russian counterpart, Yuri Ushakov. What we have here is Witkoff, supposedly a neutral mediator, essentially coaching the Russian aide on how to sell this peace deal to Donald Trump. Trump brushed it off as standard deal making, but for an intelligence analyst, how does this read?
Yeah, I think it's a calculated sabotage of the negotiating process. And there are some that say that the leak actually came from Moscow. That's an interesting theory to me. But every time something happens that we don't like, or sometimes when we do like it, we can't just rush off to the Russia did it theory, right? That's we get into the boy who cried wolf theory here. And frankly, the thinking that somehow Russia leaked this to divide the administration that looks to be more pro-Russian side, I think it's fundamentally flawed. They don't need to do that at this juncture.
Yeah, they don't because this administration is doing a perfectly decent job at dividing the administration on its own. We don't need Russia's help. It's
That's
dividing itself.
correct.
Yeah. So usually instability plays right into their hands, though. So why do you think they don't need to do that right now? Besides,
Yeah,
the obvious.
yeah, right. That we're doing it to ourselves, we being the United States. And that could also be something that we need to think about in here is how are we being manipulated as a nation? Again, we as the United States, I understand we have plenty of listeners from Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia. But uh, being on the verge of a social media civil war in the United States, that does play into Russia's hands. But in this instance, the chaos actually hurts Russia. I don't know why the Kremlin would burn a sympathetic back channel like Witkoff. Makes no sense to embarrass the very people trying to cut that deal that actually favors the Russian Federation. When you look at the timing and the impact, this has all the hallmarks of a leak from within Washington, D.C. The way I see it, it's likely a pro Ukrainian official, maybe a staff member. I have it likely that it was an aide who was on the call who's pro Ukrainian and was actually horrified by what they had heard.
So you think this was a whistleblower trying to force the administration's hand?
Yeah, for me, that's the likely scenario. So think about the timing here. That tape drops right as the Ukrainian delegation is arriving in the United States. Suddenly, the Trump administration is on the defensive. They can't look too soft on Russia because the Republicans in Congress, like one Republican, Brian Fitzpatrick, um, is up in arms about this coaching that happened from Witkoff. So it forces the White House to sort of stiffen its spine.
Well, I mean, it certainly gives Zelensky leverage he didn't have 24 hours ago. I mean, he can walk into that meeting and say, your own party is calling this a betrayal, dude.
Yeah, exactly. This is a classic move to level the playing field here. So you shine a light on the backroom dealing to shame the other side into what Ukraine would call a fairer position. And so then while the diplomats are fighting over the leaks, the military reality is shifting on the ground as well. We saw this massive missile barrage on Kyiv this week, targeting energy and military industrial sites.
Right. And I read of reports of strikes on Russia's shadow fleet.
Yeah, and that also is not insignificant. What we learn here is that Ukraine used what they are calling sea baby drones, and those sea babies hit tankers off the Turkish coast. These weren't military ships, I want to be clear. They were, though, part of Russia's shadow fleet aimed at bypassing oil sanctions.
Sea Baby's a really cute name.
It is. I like the
It
name.
it made
The
me immediately think of Madeline because you know how much
eh,
she loves the water. Anyways,
she loves the sea.
loves the
Um,
sea. She's a sea baby. She got chased by a what was it that she got chased by
a
Monterey, like,
seal. You
the day
remember
we
that one?
yeah, the
Yeah.
day we arrived, she got chased by a seal on the beach.
One
Okay,
sea
anyway,
baby to another.
from one sea baby to another. Alright, so back on topic. This kinda feels like an escalation, does it not?
Well, I think it's a strategic message. I agree. It's an escalation, but also a strategic message. So Zelensky is showing that look, I can hurt Russia's wallet as well. That speaks to the Russian people as opposed to speaking out against President Putin. Now, if Putin thinks he has the economic upper hand, Ukraine is demonstrating they can turn the Black Sea into a no go zone for those Russian oil exports. So, this is leverage. They're trying to stack chips on the table before having to come to the table for this summit for negotiating.
So where does this leave us? Witkoff goes to Moscow next week. The Kremlin is saying no concessions and it's too early for peace. So is the deal dead on arrival?
I don't think I guess say not necessarily. So my inclination is that it's not dead on arrival. No concessions is public posturing. But if they were truly not interested, they wouldn't be taking the meeting in the first place. They would have canceled it. But the danger here is the disconnect between Washington, D.C. and Europe, more specifically NATO. So we're seeing European leaders rush to repair aircraft. Airbus just ordered repairs on 6,000 jets. And they're warning against capitulation. Europe is trying to stand up an army against Russia. And so if the US pushes a deal that Europe won't back, then it's possible those security guarantees for Ukraine could fall apart. So there's all a bunch of moving parts. I don't think we'll have an answer for the next few weeks.
It kind of feels like we're watching a car crash in slow motion, like kind of hoping that the drivers swerve at the last second, or like perhaps we're watching a very painful surgery. I mean, it's ugly. There's a lot of blood, but the patient, Ukraine, in this context, might actually survive it. The question is whether the patient can survive with the scars. I guess we will find out what Witkoff brings back from Moscow next week. That sense of a future being forcibly reshaped brings us to another theater of conflict where the geography has shifted dramatically. We are looking at a map of Gaza today that looks vastly different than it did 2 years ago. We often talk about the day after scenarios in abstract terms, but if you look closely at the 53% of the territory currently held by Israeli forces, the day after has effectively already arrived. It is not just the one outlined in the brochures in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, there rarely is. What we're seeing on the ground is what I would call a forced evolution. So you have a vacuum of power created by the removal of Hamas in specific sectors, and nature, specifically human nature in a conflict zone, abhors a vacuum.
And that brings us to this patchwork of armed groups emerging in the South and North. We are seeing reports of clan based militias, criminal elements, and even splinter groups forming their own fiefdoms. All right, Kervin, you have looked at the structure of all of these groups. So, who are they really?
Yeah, it's wild. They are a mixed bag of individuals, leaders, groups. You have a local strongman. You have these local strongmen like Hossam al Astal. There's near Khan Yunis, you have Yasser Abu Shabab, he's in Rafah. And these are not ideologically unified movements. They are localized survival mechanisms. Some are centered around powerful families, others are essentially neighborhood protection rackets that have scaled up. But the critical piece of intelligence here is not just who they are, it's who is funding them.
And that leads to the admission from Prime Minister Netanyahu recently. He confirmed that Israel is backing some of these groups, and the logic being, I assume, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah, that's the classic operational logic, right? So the Israelis call it a necessity because that's going to save IDF lives. If you have a local proxy willing to fight Hamas or to police a neighborhood, you do not have to risk your own infantry to do that. So it's a force multiplier, but it is also a strategy with a very high historical failure rate.
All right, so when you look at this systemic breakdown, are you seeing parallels to other historical moments where the global order was tested this severely? Because the precursor for this kind of upheaval seems undeniable.
Yeah, and look, I could say it's not great since we know history tends to repeat itself. What's the saying? Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So let's go and look at history. Right, look at Afghanistan in the 1980s. The United States supported the Mujahideen against the Soviets. That worked tactically in the 80s, but strategically, it planted the seeds for the Taliban, fought a 20-plus year war against Al Qaeda, the Taliban, those figures. Now, that's the United States, right? Let's move closer to Israel. The support given to Islamist groups in Gaza in the 1970s and 80s to counterbalance Yasser Arafat's PLO, well, those groups eventually coalesced into, wait for it, wait for it, Hamas.
My God, that buildup, dude.
I mean, you have the group that you're currently fighting now that
Right.
you armed.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So the risk is that by arming these fragmented groups, some of whom have members with alleged links to ISIS or criminal backgrounds, Israel is essentially creating the next generation of insurgents.
you're exactly right. We have to understand that there will come a moment when those rifles given to them by Israel turn onto Israel. When you empower a warlord to clear a street, you got to remember that eventually that warlord is going to want to rule that street. They might not want to rule it according to your terms.
Maybe that's the point. Like, Israel is really smart. They know that this doesn't work, and this will give them reason to finally go in there and sweep everybody out of there the way they wanted to this time, maybe. That's
4D
me.
chess.
Oh, okay. So, which this makes the diplomatic side of this very fascinating, frankly, and very, very confusing. You have the Trump administration that pushed a peace plan that calls for an international stabilization force and a reformed Palestinian police force. But on the ground, the reality is these militias are present. So, how do you reconcile a sleek peace plan with the reality of warlordism?
You don't. That's the simple answer there. And that's the disconnect. You have a top-down diplomatic vision that clashes with a bottom-up reality. Now, the militia leaders like Al-Astal, they're claiming they are coordinating with the Americans. And if you remember last week, we talked about that board of peace. So saying they're coordinating with that board of peace. The Americans are officially denying this. Or maybe not denying it, but they're staying silent on this. It suggests a fragmentation of policy. So you have the official State Department line, and then you have the operational reality being managed by intelligence services and military commanders who are actually on the ground.
All right. Well, speaking of the American plan, let us pivot to this alternative safe communities project. This feels like a significant shift in U.S. policy. I mean, we're talking about building compounds, residential zones, specifically in the Israeli held green zone of Gaza.
Yeah, well, let's not, as a society, forget the Palestinian people as we shift from one conflict to the next. I think as the ceasefire has been implemented, we kind of said, oh, let's move to the next geopolitical event. Let's not do
No,
that.
we didn't say that.
Not us. No, I'm saying society as a
Yeah,
whole
okay.
has said
Thank
that.
you.
The headlines and CNN and BBC, Al Jazeera used to just be inundated with the Palestinian people, the suffering of the Palestinian people, right? You don't see that now. You're seeing the suffering of the Ukrainian people, which you also should be seeing as well. You're also seeing things we'll get to later on in this podcast, which I'm sure you'll have plenty of opinions on, as I will as well, which is Venezuela. Um, but I don't want us to forget the Palestinian people in this. And this is a major development. It's being led by a team operating out of Tel Aviv. Now, the concept is to build modular housing. These are containerized units like you would see in disaster relief zones. For those of you who are listening who, like myself, were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, you might be very familiar with these containerized units as well. And this is being placed out to house 20 to 25,000 people per compound.
The stated goal is humanitarian relief and economic restarting, and undoubtedly for a family currently living in a tent in the rain, a container home with a roof and a lock is a huge improvement. But the optics and the long term implications are raising alarms among the international community, as they should be.
Yes, as Dennis would say, it's the implication. And I think that the concern is that it formalizes that partition. Partition, Tiana, that you were concerned about. Maybe not concerned, but you had continued to
Mm,
say Netanyahu wanted from the very beginning.
mhm.
And so, if you build these semi permanent structures only in the Israeli controlled zones, you are effectively creating two Gazas: a green zone that is secure, that's vetted, economically linked to the outside world, and then you have a red zone controlled by Hamas that is left to fester. Didn't we talk about that last week?
I think we talked about it like the last couple weeks. We brought it up.
Yeah.
But anyway, and this vetting process that you mentioned is crucial here. So, who gets to live in these compounds that
Well, actually,
obviously Israel gets to control?
yeah. Yeah, and you're nailing the friction point there. Israeli security is going to want to vet every resident, right? So, in a place like Gaza, where Hamas has governed for nearly 2 decades, almost everyone has a cousin, a brother, a former job connected to the public sector. If you blacklist anyone with a connection to the previous administration, that being Hamas, you're going to find you have very few people eligible to enter.
It also sounds incredibly restrictive physically. I mean, the schematics describe fences and surveillance and military outposts.
Yeah, it does border on the aesthetic of an internment camp, especially since the stated intention is protection. So people cannot leave freely. And as you and I both know, there is debate among Israeli officials about whether they should even be allowed to leave freely. And this is not a neighborhood. This is a holding facility. And that brings us back to the legitimacy question. If Hamas portrays these residents as collaborators living in American built, Israeli guarded cages, it becomes very dangerous for the people living there on both sides of this matter.
So we have two parallel tracks: the military track, which is cultivating local militias to fight Hamas, and the humanitarian political track, which is trying to build these safe islands. Do these two tracks eventually converge?
In theory, the militias secure the areas for the compounds, but that's how they would converge. But in practice, you are building fragile institutions on top of quicksand. If the United States plan relies on an international stabilization force, but the actual security is being provided by a local gang leader who just switched sides, We're not talking about stability there. That's what we would call a ticking time bomb.
So essentially, we are looking at a fragmentation of territory, a fragmentation of authority, and a plan that seems to be running to catch up with the reality on the ground.
Yeah, and all of this is happening while the war is still somewhat active. Look, we are not in a post conflict phase. This is a ceasefire. This is not lasting peace. You're more like a mid conflict restructuring. And that is, historically, very difficult to pull off without creating long term insurgencies.
Well, we will have to watch how that dynamic shifts as the first of these compounds breaks ground in Rafah in the coming months.
I think we also need to watch how the Palestinian Authority responds in the West Bank. They're already signaling they're not going to accept a blanket integration of these militia members into their future forces. So that sets up a secondary conflict between the established Palestinian leadership and these new Gaza power brokers.
I mean, the friction points are seemingly endless. We're going to leave the Middle East there for now because we have urgent updates coming out of South America. The situation in Venezuela has escalated significantly over the weekend, and the intelligence picture there is shifting rapidly. But before we get into all that, I want to address the elephant in the room. The new year is already feeling pretty heavy, and if you're like us, you're just trying to make sense of the noise without getting overwhelmed. This is why we are partnering with Ground News. This is a tool we actually use to navigate that noise. We aren't just saying that, we really respect what they're doing. We specifically recommend their Vantage subscription to get the full picture of media bias. And right now, you can get 40% off by using our link. If you want to support our show and upgrade your media diet, go check it out. It's a great way to take advantage of the deal. You can go to the show notes and select the link in the description or navigate to our Instagram page where the link is in the bio. Now, as we mentioned before, we are shifting to urgent updates coming out of South America. It is rare that a single news cycle changes the entire complexion of a military operation, but that is exactly what happened this weekend. We aren't just talking about pressure on Venezuela anymore. We are talking about allegations of war crimes, a breakdown in the chain of command, and our closest ally pulling the plug on intelligence sharing.
It's a massive shift, Tiana. We've moved from a conversation about aggressive deterrence to a very specific, very ugly term, the double tap.
Exactly. So let's get right into it. The Washington Post broke a story on Friday regarding a specific strike that happened back on September 2nd. So, Kerbin, walk us through what allegedly happened that day because the details are gruesome.
Right. So this was a SEAL Team 6 operation in the Caribbean. Now, on paper, a standard maritime interdiction. They engaged a vessel suspected of trafficking narcotics, and the initial munition disabled the craft, but here's where the operation deviates from standard maritime procedure. So we had ISR platforms. These are overhead surveillance that are armed. They confirmed there were survivors. Two of the targets were, and I'm going to quote the Post here. Um, uh, they're being dramatic, I think, but I don't want to lose our humanity as well. And the Post said that the two targets were clinging to the wreckage.
How do you think that's dramatic? I mean, that's what they were probably doing if their craft was disabled.
Yes, but you can also say two individuals were waiting in the water, right? They
No, 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 no.
okay.
Waiting in the water. Waiting in
Yes.
the no. I think clinging to the wreckage is suitable. I don't think it's being dramatic, but under the law of armed conflict, those men are defined as out of the fight because obviously they can't defend themselves. They're in the water because their craft is disabled. The doctrine is clear. You transition from engagement to rescue or capture. You do not liquidate them.
But this is where things do get a bit murky. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not JAG, but I know the operational tempo of the last 20 years. I know what these special operations um, strikes involve. Now, the reporting alleges a specific verbal directive from Secretary Pete Hegseth, and this was issued pre-mission. What that means is that he was not there directing it. He made a determination post-strike that they will re-engage, and to quote him, he said that he wanted to kill everybody, zero residue. Complying with that rule of engagement, the SEAL Team 6 commander ordered a second strike, a double tap. That's what the Washington Post called it. Well, we call it, as someone who's participated in these, it's a re-engagement of enemy combatants. Now, both survivors were then executed in that.
And the Pentagon's official after-action report didn't cite, quote, eliminating combatants, end quote. They told lawmakers the second strike was to remove a navigation hazard.
Yeah, this administration is terrible with communicating things that are happening with the military. I'd maybe put that on Secretary Hegseth. This is my opinion. I think they're very bad at their PR. This is bureaucratic camouflage at best. Look, a wooden boat in the middle of the Caribbean is not a hazard to a supertanker or a destroyer. That level of transparency is likely why Capitol Hill is on fire right now. But look, I'm not trying to sugarcoat this at all. But we have normalized kinetic strikes just like this, maritime kinetic strikes against terrorist, Islamic terrorists off the coast of Africa, off the coast of Yemen, for 2 decades across multiple administrations. That is the established precedence. The re-engagement is an established precedent. If Congress finds this morally abhorrent now, they should have legislated against it 20 years ago. So for me, right now, the outrage in D.C. feels a little performative.
But it does contextualize the sudden resignation that we saw last month. That makes a lot more sense in hindsight.
I think you're absolutely right to flag that. Now, what you're talking about here is the U.S. Southcom commander. He walked away just 1 year into his tenure, and at the time, it was abrupt. It was unexplained, unexpected. Now it reads like a classic resignation and protest, right? But I want to be clear. Everyone debating the legality of this re-engagement, this, quote, double tap, end quote, they're missing the forest for the trees. The media, Twitter, DC, they're kind of focusing on the mechanics. Stop trying to argue the ballistics because you're going to lose on precedent. The real debate is the classification. We're designating drug smugglers as foreign terrorists to justify rules of engagement usually reserved for a war zone. That's the conversation that we need to be having.
Okay, so let's pull on that thread because that is the critical distinction. You're saying the administration is essentially hacking the legal framework. By slapping a terrorist label on a cartel operative, they are bypassing the entire judicial process, right?
Possibly, yeah. It's a jurisdictional sleight of hand. Look, if this is classified as a counternarcotics operation, that's a law enforcement action. You need Coast Guard cutters, bullhorns, you need handcuffs, you need evidence to present at a trial. But if you designate that boat as a terrorist asset for national security, the Caribbean instantly transforms from international waters into a battle space.
And does that change the rules of engagement entirely?
Changes? I don't know about changes, but it sure as hell rewrites the rules of engagement. Suddenly, that guy on the boat isn't a criminal suspect with constitutional or human rights. He's an enemy combatant. In the eyes of the U.S. military, an enemy combatant does not get a Miranda warning. He gets a kinetic solution. The administration is using the terminology of the war on terror to solve a drug enforcement problem because it's faster, it's cleaner, and it doesn't require a courtroom.
But that opens a Pandora's box. If a wooden fishing boat in the Caribbean is now a valid military target, where does the theater of war end? Are we going to see Hellfire missiles used against fentanyl labs just south of the Rio Grande?
Yeah, like that is exactly the slippery slope the JAG Corps has been warning about for years. And once you define trafficking as terrorism, the entire world is a free fire zone. You are militarizing police work. So when people argue about the re engagement, the double tap, they are arguing about the symptom. The disease is the decision to treat a drug bust like the raid on bin Laden's compound.
This administration seems to love militarizing police work since they're sending National Guard members to all of our large cities to police everything.
Yeah, and I think we'd be remiss not to mention the young National Guard member who lost her life in DC.
Yeah,
So our
for sure.
thoughts and prayers do go out to that family, especially over the Thanksgiving holiday. I mean,
For sure.
I can't even imagine.
Right. Okay, so obviously you were fired up about this one. And despite all of this, the legal questions, the loss of allies, the administration is actually accelerating the operations. We have President Trump on Truth Social unilaterally declaring Venezuelan airspace closed.
Yeah, and again, not a lawyer. Let me reiterate that. But I do believe that this has no basis in international law. Someone please correct me. You cannot just truth post that another sovereign nation's airspace is closed, but that did happen, and the effect is real. Major airlines canceled flights because the FAA is warning of heightened military activity. It is now a de facto blockade.
And this ties back to the Thanksgiving call the president made to the troops. He said actions on land would start very soon.
Yeah, a continuation of Operation Southern Spear. We have the USS Gerald R. Ford sitting off the coast. That's the largest warship ever built. We have 15,000 troops, and now we have a designated enemy. The administration has designated the Cartel de la Sol, which they claim is run by Maduro, and the Tren de Aragua gang. They've claimed both of those are foreign terrorist organizations.
So they're building a legal framework where hitting a Venezuelan government official is the same as hitting an Al Qaeda operative.
Exactly. At this moment, the administration that ran on stopping wars is blurring the lines between counternarcotics and counterterrorism to bypass the need for a congressional declaration of a war. But as we saw with the September 2nd strike, the legal framework is a little fragile here. If they start hitting land targets, barracks, convoys, infrastructure, using these same rules of engagement, that re-engagement, that double tap incident that will look like a minor footnote compared to the conflict that could erupt in Venezuela.
Well, we will definitely be keeping an eye as this story develops. Garvin, is there anything else you want to discuss this week?
No, I think that's all I have for now. Done. I'm off my soapbox. We can talk about whatever you want.
I don't have anything to talk about.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, oh yeah. We hope everybody who celebrates Thanksgiving had a nice Thanksgiving. If you don't celebrate Thanksgiving and you celebrate, what is it called? American Indian something.
No, that's for you to know, not me.
I can't remember what it's
All
called.
I will say is welcome to Krampus season.
Yes, Krampus season. You better do some Krampus stuff, dude.
Oh man. I have it
Oh,
mapped
man.
out for us next year for sure.
It's gonna be so fun. I can't wait to have my first Krampus. That's what I'm looking forward to most. Hopefully, we can get Charlotte kidnapped.
Yeah, that's what I want.
Yeah, I want Charlotte to be taken. Anyways, actually, I don't know if Charlotte would appreciate that, but maybe, maybe I don't
She's
know.
too
I
old
don't know.
for it anyway, so.
No, I don't know. She's got a really cute, sweet little voice,
Yeah.
so everyone thinks that she's younger
If
than she
she
is.
if she just hunches down a little bit.
She'll just hunch over a little bit, talk in her sweet little voice, and they'll be like, "This is definitely a 10-year-old."
All right, anything else you want to talk about?
It's my birthday this week.
There we go.
That's it.
I
That's
know
all.
that
That's
took
it.
everything within you to say that.
No, not really, but yeah, whatever. Whatever. Another year. I made it another year. Thank you. Thank you.
You did it. We did
I
it,
did it.
Joe.
We did it, Joe. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to This Week Explained. We hope that you found it both informative and engaging. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. For more in-depth coverage of these stories and more, be sure to follow us on social media at This Week Explained.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.